So it's such a pleasure to be here. I want to start with expressing enormous gratitude and thank you to all the colleagues who have joined from all over the world. For some, it is early morning and for some, it's very late night. So thank you once again, I appreciate, and I promise that I won't let you down. And this will be a very, very provocative class, session. I'm using class because I'm a teacher. Anyway, so let's start with and thank you, Noreen, for such a rich presentation of mine. I think the expectation went too high, and I hope not to kind of Okay, well, look, let's start with the presentation right away. So this is what the title is. I've made a couple of other presentations under similar titles, but every time it has become sharper and more kind of complicated for myself, not only for those who listen to me, but I've realized my own mistakes every time I present it. And therefore, this is going under further refinement. And also, we are thinking of publishing something under this title. Right now, so I'm going to tell you 5 interrelated stories. One of them is education, research, and knowledge production, where I'll speak about key argument. Then I quickly move into decolonization, recolonization, indigenization, discourses, largely building on what Iveta Silva spoke a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to speak too much about that because I think we all know about this. Then immediately go into education, research, and knowledge production in Tajikistan and Central Asia. I'll be using Tajikistan as the case largely, but not exclusively. So we will speak about status and realities, and then come back to the questions of decolonization, recolonization, indigenization. So that's where I would like to spend time rather than at the start of this. And then speak a little bit about where do we go from there in terms of implications for education, research, and so on. So, okay. So the story goes like this, that we currently in the global South live in a status of post-colonialism, which actually is, in other words, a continuation of colonialism under different guides and different names. And the way out of this status is through knowledge and research and through knowledge production. And knowledge, as we know today, is the major force, not only the major commodity. You know that, for example, if you look at World Bank and others reports, knowledge society, knowledge economy, knowledge as the main force, knowledge as the main commodity, technology, and so on. So the richer person today apparently is the one who has more knowledge and more up-to-date knowledge and much quality, higher knowledge, and so on. So based on this, we are going to focus on this, and it's quite closely related to education and research, because research is seen as central process by which this knowledge is produced. Now, of course, I have said here knowledge production also, that I want to say that research also has a particular kind of notions to it in terms of its boundaries, and therefore the word knowledge production might be a better one for expanding that notion, expanding those boundaries, and also going beyond some people might feel as a Western idea, because research is also seen as a problem, especially many people who come from decolonization perspective have accused research, particularly Eurocentrist research and science, for colonization and for what they call as the darker side of modernity. These were all spoken last time. I'm not going to spend less time on this, but I just want to say that research, for example, we know about Maori researcher Linda T.Y. Smith, and we also know about Edward Said. Both of them have spoken about how research, particularly what they believe is scientific and what believe Eurocentric, has been part of the colonization and all other kind of negative things. We also know stories about James Cook in North America and how he was accompanied by many scientists and so on. So just brief reminder about problematicity of the concept of research and knowledge production. So it is one. So then this current situation, therefore, within this colonization of knowledge or coloniality of knowledge discourse and situation is that life in the global south is largely in education, including is situated within the processes of policy borrowing and policy lending. And many of these policies have either been misused, abused, or they have failed, leading to increasing inequalities, increasing dependencies, increasing frustration, and many other problems. And under the name of global best practices, which, as many people, including Yvette last time spoke, are essentially Western, particular Western practices that are universalized and presented as global best. And we'll speak about that later. So that's where we start. Where we start is from there. And then we go into indigenization and decolonization. To what end? I'm going to challenge the drives, the passion, the current obsession with indigenization and decolonization, based on the research and experience that I have as a scholar of an indigenous and marginalized communities. Okay, so then my argument is that we work instead of decoupling, instead of rupture, instead of disobedience and all other kind of radical approaches. I suggest that we work with, despite and against best practices, Eurocentrism, and other alternative epistemologies. So that's the framework I suggest. So let me move now into next one. So these are the sources of my data. It's, as Noreen said, more than 20 years of engagement and education and development in Central Asia and South Asia. And of particular interest are there, of course, my work with international organization we just mentioned, but also my graduate course called Education, Research, and Knowledge Production in the Global South. We do here splitting work on identifying alternatives to Eurocentrism. And we have had the hardest time in this. So let's go further. So this is, I want to show you, this was shown by Iveta Silva last time. And this shows about pluriversality. This shows about multiplicity of approaches to knowledge production in the 21st century and so on. So I'm going to move on with this. So what are the key concepts? The key concepts are colonialism as dark side of modernity, and we live in post-colonial condition where colonialism is happening largely hegemonically, not necessarily all the time. We still see use of military force and powers, but quite a lot of it is through education and through knowledge and through music and through arts and through all other kind of media and so on. So that's what is called hegemonic, where we actually like it. We take it in because it comes in soft power. Then knowledge, as we said, and knowledge production as defining forces, and Eurocentrism currently leads the knowledge production, which actually means that the knowledge production, both in the North and South, is presumably grounded in Western secular Eurocentrist ontologies, epistemologies, and methodologies, as well as research techniques and methods. And this actually links us to an important point, which is coloniality of knowledge mentioned earlier, which actually consists of the fact that all models of cognition and thinking, seeing and interpreting and acting in the world, the subject-object relations, the organization of disciplines at universities and schools, all of that entirely depends on the norms and rules created in the 16th century by Western modernity and offered to all of us as universal, delocalized, and disembodied global best practices. Another important concept is zero-point epistemology. Within this, it is presumed or presented as if the Western scholars are taken for granted, objective, they don't have biases, they are fair, they are highest quality, and we should listen to them because there is no problem with them. There is no bias involved. There are no limitations. So that is what, in a rude way, called zero-point epistemology. The West doesn't have to explain to anybody why that they have evidence or why they do things the way they do. We should accept it as is. That's what zero-point epistemology is. And we see it very clearly in politics, at least, global politics. So this has led to academic dependency and academic imperialism. And it also led to colonization of minds and dependency of everybody around the world, including scholars and researchers and students and politicians and leaders from the global south. And some of the ways how this happens is, we already spoke about media and culture and so on, and but we did not speak about fund and money. But what is also interesting in education is that it is believed or presented that the Western universities are actually promoting that, but also non-Western too. It is that all current universities and schools around the world are essentially reproducing Western hegemony. That's what it believed to be said within the decolonization discourse. And then graduate studies where people like Sarfaroz, Niyozov, and Noreen and others are brainwashed in the Western universities to become stooges for the Western academic colonialism. And then I'm just being rude and rough and hilarious a little bit just to make it spicy. I will speak that this is not true later, but just at this stage. So the publications and conferences are also another way, especially in English, especially in northern parts of the world, where we are speaking and we are presented and socialized into these English language best practices, where South is often seen as testing ground, which believably leads to epistemicized. You know, epistemicized is a word that is used for elimination and disappearance of alternative knowledges, languages, cultures under the academic colonialism and imperialism. Some of the key professors in this area have questioned whether non-Europeans think. There is an article by Mignolo, Walter Mignolo, Argentinian scholar. He was mentioned very much last time. And then Kishore Mahbubani, I think is from Singapore. He wrote a book, the whole book on Can Asians Think? And then Tlostanova Madina, who currently I think is in Sweden, but she was working in Russia, has written a book called Can Post-Soviets Think? And then we know about Spivak, who started all this by saying, can poor people, can marginalized communities, can small communities, can subaltern think? So, and then Tlostanova and Mignolo have said the following: so far, the Soviet space has not been able to demonstrate to the world and to itself and to its own people that they can think. This does not mean that the situation has to stay like this, but there is almost no time left to reverse it. So I want to start with this provocative statement that someone is possibly herself comes from this background, is saying that we are possibly, we've lost the train of thinking. We're too late now to start producing something. So further, how then they suggest to go? They suggest that the radical approaches are that we do epistemic disobedience, break with the Western and colonial approaches, and then delink with them, decouple with them, and we indigenize and we produce culturally responsive pedagogy research. So there is a need set for conscious willingness on the part of the post-Soviet social scientists to decolonize knowledge in media and knowledge and methods, critically engage and get rid of epistemic grounds of modernity, its disciplines and methods, which in the dominant system are presented as the only legitimately existing forever. Then Eurocentrist research is presenting to present a very narrow human experience because of its focus on empiricism, logical positivism, and scientific focus. And Eurocentric research is implicated in colonization, racism, in eugenics, and environmental degradation. And what are presented as alternative, the following, some. These are not necessarily the only. Afrocentrism, Islamization, new left and progressive ideologies, revival of ethno-religious myths and thoughts, such as Hindu nationalism, Confucianism, Aryanism, and so on. And then land-sensitive epistemologies. So these are just few alternatives about how to go. Now let's go to research in post-Soviet Tajikistan. Take a little break. What's going on in the post-Soviet Tajikistan and Central Asia, I would like to say, is that we have some of the interesting things. Let me just close it. Yeah. So in post-Soviet Tajikistan, we have a typology. There are all types of research happening. People are writing, people are producing knowledge, people are doing research. That's an important thing. Now, what we have is historically, one of them is pre-Islamic and Islamic approaches, which actually show the superiority of Islamic knowledge, superiority of the prophets, imams, and even ulamas over the secular scholars. And we have ideas such as ilm, ta'lim, tarbiyah, adab, ijtihad, qiyas, isnad, as research and education ideas that have taken from Arabic and Islamic heritage. Knowledge is perceived to be, true knowledge is perceived to be sacred. And then any knowledge that questions that sacred or religious knowledge is not accepted. And then reform is seen only within Islamic framework. We have Jadidism. Adib Khalid is writing endlessly about these things and so on. So, and then we have textual studies such as Safarnamas. We also know about medical research by people like Ibn Sina, and anthropological studies by Biruni, and so on. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that there is a Soviet style of research that was developed in the Soviet time, but continues to be. And indeed, the Soviets try to do a kind of epistemic breakup and decoupling from the Western capitalist Eurocentrism, although in themselves they were Eurocentrists in a way, because Marxism is also a production of European mind and European research legacy, particularly Enlightenment and modernity. But nevertheless, so they have their own candidate doctoral degrees, books and monographs are produced. The idea was, or the purposes was to prove, now look at, compared with the Islamic one, superiority of dialectical and historical materialism and Marxism-Leninism. I clearly remember reading a book by a professor on Ismailis, in which he presented Ismailism as very progressive Islamic idea, which fell short just few steps from reaching to Marxism-Leninism dialectic. So almost right there, but just a little short. So that was the Soviet style of proving, of writing. There was tight relationship with state and party, psychology, pedagogy, didactics. Some of the Soviet time scholarship reached globally. Vygotsky's ideas are, particularly social constructivism, are today dominant education philosophy around the world. This is something amazing to have, but it is. And then use of Russian language in scholarship, supervision by Russian scholars was quite important in the Soviet time, although not all the time, but it was seen as a prestige. And then there was a very interesting approach also, teachers writing on their best experiences. And lots of teachers' writings were happening. So there was a lot of research happening within the confine of dialectical and historical materialism in education. But interestingly enough, that the critiques by Sarah Amsler, as well as Tolostanov and others, is that like the West, the Soviets too created local academies and institutions and scholars in the periphery. Now, periphery could be Central Asia. Many of the locals, similar to those trained by the West in their colonies, do not see themselves as colonized minds. So the Central Asians, in other words, would not see themselves as colonized. And this is interesting because when I led the Aga Khan Institute for Educational Development in Pakistan, My professors also did not see themselves as being colonized in their mind. Although I was telling them that I might be colonized, they did not like the idea. So, but let's go on. So these scholars do not see themselves as colonized. And they don't see themselves as conduits for reproducing Russian and Western hegemonies. Russian Soviets at the time of Soviet Union dismissed the local ways of producing knowledge and replaced them with the modern West. And then further, Soviet social sciences, being a poor copy-paste of the Western social science, tweaked into a progressive Marxist-Leninist liberation ideology, but I actually camouflaged neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism. Now, these are charges made against the Soviet scholarship. I'm not fully sure about these. I think it's much more complex, and I'll speak a little more about this. Because, look, I mean, the question then becomes, I'll speak about this later, let's wait for that. But so then let's go further. Types of research in Central Asia, further. So the one in post-Soviet one now we have is research continues. People are producing knowledge. People are writing books. Look at the two books on the left side. Pedagogica Epticor, Innovative Pedagogy by Sharif Zoda, Karimova, Solaimoni, Bulbulov, and others. And these are well-known, renowned scholars who crossed Soviet to post-Soviet times and have written very important and very interesting scholarly work. Fayzullah Sharif Zoda is another one who wrote a very interesting book on inclusive pedagogy and so on. And as you see in Jahan Ro Nigar Bachashme Khirad, he uses a word from Rudaki, a 9th century Tajik scholar, which says, look at this world with the eye of wisdom, not with the eye of that body. So anyway, there is a lot of studies and education that are framed within the ethnopedagogy. And ethnopedagogy could be seen as a form of indigenization pedagogy, where the local scholars look back at their legacy, pre-Islamic into Zoroastrian times, Islamic, and even Soviet, and then bring from it the best that comes from the nation and its history, and that fits and aligns with the larger global humanitarian or humanistic values and frameworks. In other words, showing that the Tajik history and culture produced ideas as good as anyone else in the world. So that's what ethnopedagogy is. And it's an important part and an interesting thing, but we will speak a little more about this. But history and tradition are brought up, patriotism, national thinking, sometimes leading into nationalism, and nationalist ideologies are being promoted. Use of English literature is very limited. Indeed, one of the articles I just read by Fayzullah Sharif Zoda, which actually quotes English sources. But when I looked into those English sources, those were actually Russian sources written in English or translated into English. I was surprised, why would he do that? Anyway, experimental, quasi-experimental, sociometric approaches with some intervention and proof of that intervention are described by the researchers. National pride is close, and the research is closely connected with the state and state ideology. And it's also very deeply connected with Russian and Eurasian scholarship. There is a journal of Vestnik, and to be honest, education articles and degrees are quite a big number of them. And PhD or candidates are being produced quite a lot. So then there is a Western-driven research, which actually divides into two parts. One of them is done by NGOs, bilateral and multilateral organizations. Most of them are technical reports that talk about how things are, the situational analysis, and so on. Local scholars are oftentimes used as data collectors, report producers, but in some cases, they're also publishers. For example, look at this book, Brain Drain versus Brain Circulation. This book is a mixture of scholarly and technical production. And lots of local scholars actually have written articles there. And then it responds to both external and internal interests and ideas. So let's say, for example, religious extremism or gender. These are not necessarily Western interests only, as some people would say, but they're also interests of local leadership, local population, and therefore they are researched, they need to meet both needs. Some of the topics such as gender, Islamic extremism, radicalism, security, crisis research, competency-based education, migration, and so on. So these are not necessarily the interest of West or interest of World Bank. These are also very interesting and important issues at the local level, and they need to be studied. The big question is, how are they studied, to what interest, and who they serve? But that's a different story. There are lots of monitoring and evaluation studies that are not published, but are existing and quite valuable studies. Survey, quantitative, and highly focused approaches are seen as methods of these studies. They draw attention of the policymakers. Indeed, they draw more attention of the policymakers than the academic research that I'll speak later on about. So some of the NGOs and some of the universities, actually local Western universities, have very strong agendas of producing knowledge. I was involved with Human Dynamics of European Union, and they had a very big project of which was developing local research and knowledge production capacity. And I will say why, what happened to that and what was the issue. But it was there. To say that they are not interested is simply, or they are pursuing pure colonial agendas, is not true. So it's much more complex. Open Society Institute, I worked with it for many years, and then I did projects, and we talked about these very issues very openly, and indeed there was no any problem with this. University of Central Asia, recent convocation, for example, is Iris the Aga Khan spoke about, that I would like my students sometimes to be able to produce local knowledges, which are important aspiration, and show that it is not just a one-sided top-down, west-east, and the academic dependency and so on. However, the question, of course, is what kind of knowledge, by which method, to what end? That's a different story. We'll come to that. So some of the critiques and counter-critiques are like this. While the post-Soviets abandoned Marxist-Leninist epistemology ideology for data analysis, and they are now using a hodgepodge eclectic approach, jumbling together contradictory ideas from the Western progressives and neoliberals, from neo-imperialists and Eurasianists in their research, which results in inability to situate their research in the broader scholarship, as well as inability to contribute new knowledge. Quite a tough critique. Amsler spoke, critique of global capitalism and liberal ideologies of democracy, long considered the hallmark of post-colonial writing in the West, has very little resonance in Central Asia, where the colonial past itself was socialist. And then Central Asian researchers refused to question the generally accepted Western scientific terminology and approaches, defend them, once again, as presumably objective and uncontaminated by locality or by ideology. And silently, they agree that knowledge is always produced in the West. Quite tough. Tlostanova is very provocative. So let's go into the last one. The last typology is academic scholars in Western academia. Now, there are Western-born scholars such as Chris Wissel, Alan DeYoung, and David, and many other my friends here. But there are also former Soviet scholars in Western academia, like me, like Sarfaroz Niyozov. And then there are post-Soviet graduates in Western academies. We have now some of them already graduated, I know I don't want to mention their name, but so they do quite a lot of research, produce knowledge, but there are some issues there. One is that their research is not accessible to local educators and policymakers. Part of it is because of language, as Duchamp has mentioned this many times. But however, quite a lot of it is that they are not accepted and recognized by local scholars, by INGOs and NGOs. So this local Western scholarship produced by people like me is oftentimes seen as not good scholarship enough. I remember one person of Tajik background read my PhD thesis, and my PhD thesis won 2 best awards of the time. And when she read, she said, I liked it, but according to our criteria, this is not research. And we know that PhD is the toughest time and the most rigorous time for producing research. If we really genuinely produce a research with all the criteria, that is a PhD. Of course, it is underdeveloped, but that's what it is. Yet this is how it was seen. And I've seen many local scholars who have actually denigrated their Western friends and even relatives and colleagues by saying that their project, their product is not good scholarship, and so on. So similar to the NGOs and universities, for example, very recently an article, report was produced by University of Central Asia on status of education in Kyrgyzstan. And I read it, very comprehensive, very good report with all the things. I will speak a little more about that later, but there is no any single reference to any scholars of local or Western academia on the education issues, while all those people have written more than once about the very issues. So I have actually asked that person, can you tell me why you never quoted anybody from the local or Western? And we still have not spoken about this, but I have a promise soon to talk to person. So then we have Western style universities in Central Asia, where I already spoke about this, that were also such as Nazarbayev, such as Aga Khan University of Central Asia, American University, and so on. So let's go on. The post-Soviets, now here is an accusation of people like me, leveled at people like me. The post-Soviet scholars, whether working in the former Soviet Union or even West, do not have visibility, cannot challenge the Western post-Soviet narratives of the Soviet countries. The post-Soviet space and its social sciences and scientists for the rest of the world, and the refusal of the global north to accept the post, in other words, as if the northern universities, the post-Soviet scholars are not seen as rational subjects, and they're not visible, and their ideas are not accepted. I mean, this is written by Tolostanova, and I would disagree with her very deeply. Any scholars elaborating their own critical post-Soviet theory formulated from the border position between the Western and Soviet Russian modernity or coloniality without subscribing to any of them are immediately marginalized. Now, let me tell about my experience of refuting this. I come from the smallest village in Tajikistan. I'm a triply marginalized person. And I did my graduation at one of the top universities in the world. And indeed, OIZ is fourth or fifth best education institution in the world. And my PhD won 2 best awards. And I was later on won position at the university. And I've gone through the rank, and today I am acting associate dean of the university. And I've been accepted by my friends at the academia, by my colleagues, both within the Central Eurasian Society, with SIG, Comparative Education Society. In my own university, my ideas are sought out after, listened to. And I am being told by people that I am marginalized, I'm invisible, and so on. Take another case of not me, but Iveta Silova. Iveta Silova was president of the Comparative Education Society. And her writing is at the top of comparative education. She is the leading scholar of comparative education. Coming from a marginalized background, from Latvia, with mixed background and so on, I don't know how is, the only thing I could perhaps blame is that I'm not producing enough and I'm not challenging enough. And I raise questions about Islamophobia, about academic colonialism, about Russophobia. And no one has put me down for those. People listen to them. And indeed, today at the OIZ University of Toronto, we talk about inclusivity in our faculty hiring. We specifically look for professors and scholars who are not from white and not from West and not from North background. And going beyond me, George Nana Day is a top Afrocentrist scholar. He is a top scholar at OIZ. His views and ideas have led to the opening of Afrocentrist schools in Canada. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is rosy and everything is perfect and beautiful. There are resistances, there are critiques of us, there are questions of us, and we acknowledge that we are not perfect. But to say that we are invisible, that we are accepting everything and we will not be given any place if we don't do this, is an essentialization, and it is not grounded in full scholarship. Indeed, I would say that I don't know if I would have that visibility and acceptance and appreciation in the former Soviet Union, including in Tajikistan. As I said, that very little appreciation of research that we do, very little acceptance is happening indeed, and the back home rather than in the Western academia. Let's move on. So further into, now this comes from my field works. So my field work, actually, I did lots of work development, but I also interviewed people. And one of the things I found is that there is very little appreciation and acknowledgement of pedagogical research or education research. Indeed, pedagogy is not seen as a serious subject and as something that is of equal status to other social sciences. So people who do research in pedagogy or in education are seen as almost like second-class scholars. There are, of course, some of the people who do research and accepted at a high level, but they are not called candidate of pedagogy. They are called candidate of philosophy or sociology. So if you want to become accepted as a high-level scholar in education, then the message to you is that you do a candidate or PhD in philosophy or in sociology or in history rather than in pedagogy. So that's one interesting insight I found, which is I mean, it's not generalizable, but it is. The other thing is candidate and PhD studies are main research activities. Beyond them, it is ad hoc, it is when you can do things. There is very limited value of research for policy making. That's what I found. Policy making in Central Asia, in Tajikistan, in Central Asia, is largely done with limited connection with research. Of course, with quantitative and PISA and examination, yes, but qualitative, anthropological, sociological research has a limited value. People in their research projects pay little attention to research questions. They're actually represented, very few people actually have clearly formulated key and sub-research questions. Locating one study in a particular framework is not there. We know that in the Soviet time, we all had to locate our studies in dialectical materialism and Marxism-Leninism. Today, some people do in ethnic nationalism or civic nationalism, but generally it is in taking ideas from everywhere, and in that sense, Sarah Amsler might be right. Research methods are oftentimes confused with teaching methods. Breadth is taken much more seriously than depth. For example, recently I was an appraisal for research that actually studied the impact of 5 global civilizations on Tajik culture. Now imagine I'm in a PhD study like that kind. The study was quite good. I was very impressed with the young person's ability to grasp the key issues about these 5 global civilizations. But look at the breadth. I mean, I told them in my appraisal that you should have taken one of these civilizations and gone into depth and do field work. So field work is generally not seen as important or not done all the time, although some intervention related are done and some of it is done through international organization. Data analysis is very unclear how it is done. It is largely related to the tasks of a priori. It doesn't come from the data. It is all predefined. Research ethics is a major issue. And I'll speak about this. I did an analysis of survey that was done by the Ministry of Education with an international organization with 150 people with serious ethical questions. Questions such as reflexivity and positionality and subjectivity are new, almost when I presented them in my research, people found them very interestingly, but they never have done them or never heard about them. There is rivalry and misacceptance and there are all sorts of judgments between Soviet research, post-Soviet research, Western, what is better, what is not better kind of things. And there is also intergeneration conflict between young scholars who are more prone to learn from the Western methods, and then also old scholars who are more into Soviet style of researching. So you have that kind of tension too. Further, education, research, and knowledge capacity is limited. There is limited link between research and policy making, I said. And this is from my research, my survey. I say there that I argue that the survey data on the report by a particular institution, it was a report, survey data and brief report by an institution, or that I'm not mentioning the name, have insufficient value in understanding and developing the two items of the partnership. One of them is evidence-based policy making, and second, research capacity development. However, I argue that the survey data and the report are helpful in understanding the education situation, issues and problems faced by the system, including especially by the higher education institutions of the country. In other words, research questions and survey questions were about policy making and education research, but the answers were about education situation, not about these two things. So it's very interesting project that I found. Anyway, theoretical studies are predominant, little knowledge about research, recent Western research ideas and methods. Research is monopolized by academies and scholars. It is controlled. And other conditions are there is almost little or no funding. Funding comes quite often from Western agencies or bilateral, multilateral, and so on. But there is, I even heard about research grants when I asked them. Salaries are extremely poor. Stipends for the PhD students are around 700 to 1,000 Somonese. That is very little for a scholar to continue, and therefore they are forced to work in order to survive and do their PhD studies or candidate studies. Environment is not conducive to critical studies and academic framework. Research is undervalued and limited, and then there is question of plagiarism that is already public, and we know about this from social media. These are few notes from interviews with local scholars. So one of them told me, scholars do not want to think. There is no money, there is no time, and there is no need to think. No one needs their thinking. Indeed, no one needs their thinking. They need to implement well what is there rather than produce something new. Most of our scientific work are written in the frame of communist ideology and do not respond to current needs. Traditionally, we are post-Soviet, which implies we grew up on the Soviet basis. Our thinking, both Soviet and pre-Soviet, are not oriented to Western. So moving towards Western ways of knowledge production would require complete transformation of our values and thinking. Research that are being done are not bringing many benefits. Currently, we are not able to produce ideas about our society's education. We need to look at what we have elsewhere and assess that. I agree that our students cannot think. I know that from my teaching. We should not borrow from Arab countries or Pakistan or from this so-called South-South collaboration. We can borrow from them only problems. They do not have solutions. Now, these are some of the tough points. I disagreed with this, but this is what I found. It is the traditional pre-Soviet and Soviet methods, or our indigenous methods, that do not allow us to think. We do not want to borrow new methods from the West because they make us think and analyze and solve problems. We contextualize, critique, domesticate, and adapt. Why should we produce everything new? What is wrong with critical thinking, culturally sensitive pedagogy, child-centered pedagogy, outcome-based learning, disability studies, gender studies, and list goes on. Knowledge is not anyone's property. It is global and always travels like airs and birds. Research is the job of academies and universities and not of teachers. Okay, very few are last one. So this is, I already spoke about this in terms of a survey that I did. Let me move on. So now add to all of these things that the problems in education are even more basic than research. Research could be seen as almost like a luxury. When you look at the reports starting from 1996 till today by local and international organizations, and they talk about decreasing access and dropout, poor quality of teaching, irrelevance, teacher status and image, education and job gaps, public spending, its inefficient and inefficient use, corruption, lack of autonomy and freedom for the school leaders, information technology, how to handle COVID and pandemic, science issues, lab issues, facilities, textbooks, examination and assessment system, high order thinking, problem solving in 21st century competencies, language issues, quality of teaching, citizenship issues, gender and other inequalities, rural inequality, gender inequality, ethnic inequality, intolerance, school interruptions, school buildings, parental involvement,
Absolutely.
and so on. So let's move on, finish. So now come back to the discourse on decolonization. So there are some tough questions. What is colonization exactly? Why then decolonization is only about Western, Eurocentric, secular, and scientific? What about Islamic? What about Chinese? What about Russian? What about internal colonization? And then is Western, Eurocentric, scientific ideas all that bad? Where do Soviet time approaches stand in decolonization and indigenization? For example, Soviet Union, some people, as we spoke earlier, quoted someone, some people say it was camouflage for another form of colonialism. But in the Soviet times, they created schools and roads and libraries and telephones and many other things in smallest villages. Literacy went 99%. And poor people like me from very large family managed from rural place, managed to get through the system and get where I am. Now, is that the same as Western colonialism in India and Pakistan? I'm asking this question. What about Islamic knowledge and ideas? And what about these alternative epistemologies? Are they all good and perfect? What about contextualization of Western ideas to serve local people and local ideas and local policies? Is it still colonization? What about role of local elites and local scholars in the process of colonization and decolonization in education and mind? No academic and no colonization of mind and any other type happens without participation and complicity of local elites and people. Role of religions in colonization. We now talk about Christianity's role in colonizing and terrible things that are happening around the world. What about Islam? Is it anti-colonial, non-colonial? When something that itself must have been colonial becomes then anti-colonial. For example, Islam in South Asia and Central Asia came and took over the existing cultures and existing ways of living. And then later on, it became this anti-Western, anti-colonial discourse. So how far do we go with decolonization? What exactly is indigenous? Is it going to the past? Is it romanticizing the past? What should be our approach to the past? When we speak about those past ideas and discourses, such as Islamic, or even pre-Islamic, such as Zoroastrian, Buddhist, Hinduist, are they pure? Don't they have inequities? Were there injustices, not injustices? Who produced knowledge? What was all other issues that we talk about that today? Anyway, so the other tough questions about journey towards decolonization. So Mignolo presents that the critical task of decolonization is to produce pluriversality. And it is to create an open horizon of pluriversality where many different worlds and worldviews can coexist on a non-imperial and non-hierarchical basis. Beautiful. But the question is, how do we deal with these multiple perspectives? Example is COVID. When COVID hit us, now, how do we deal with this? Should we allow for these multiple perspectives with their implications? Or what we did is that we ultimately reverted back to the science. The other thing is, how do we deal with when something that we used to call myth or relics of the past or religious or emotional is now becoming almost like equal with the scientific and rational, and how do we now deal with the North and South when everything is blurred? Where do we go from there in terms of decision making if we go for pluriversality? Or should we go into decolonization and indigenization as a syncretic analysis of the best ideas from the past and present and futures? And do it through critical and constructive approach, accompanied by reflexivity and by genuine dialogue between past and present, local and global, North and South. And if we go for the last one, what would be the criteria for judging and for sitting on the table? Implications. So education, research, and knowledge production are important for decolonization, for developing indigenous dignity and honor, for creating prosperous nation states in Central Asia. And therefore, research culture should be developed, but research should be demystified. Research is not the final truth. It should be seen as knowledge constructed by humans and therefore amenable to critique and challenge and reconstruction. And then it should be democratized from few scholars into teachers and everybody. It should be diversified in terms of epistemologies, in terms of frameworks, ideologies, and methods. And it should be based on dialogue with self and others. Decolonization of knowledge requires scholars to engage in decolonizing their own values and beliefs and practices, their own subjectivity, so that the understanding of the self is transformed and the subjectivity rebuilt. Very important. And then the indigenous needs to be created and produced as a result of synthesis, not dug from out and romanticized and represented as something that is perfect. And then work critically and constructively with, despite and against Eurocentrism, Islamocentrism, and ethnocentrism, and see them as social construct so as to produce something new. Thank you so much. Universities are very important here, and the critical aim of university is to shape not a submissive and loyal, narrow specialist, but a critical thinker, self-reflexive and independent individual who never accepts any ready-made truths at face value, and who truly and unselfishly is interested in the world around us, in its diversity, and strives to make the world more harmonious, more fair, and for everyone, and not for a particular privileged group. Thank you so much. I've critiqued Lostanov a lot, but here I want to give her credit. I want to thank you, and this is the end of my presentation. We can start the question and answer. Thank you.